Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we're moving on, chapter 11, and we're going to talk about slavery today. So, yeah, I just want to preface this. I am not promoting any ideas. I am just giving you the facts straight from the book. And slavery, as bad as it was, just giving you the information, okay? So cotton slavery and the old South. Okay, slavery is much intertwined in American history, in our old ways. It's sadly in our DNA. So let's get started. Okay, so the cotton economy is often referred to as King Cotton. Why was cotton so popular? Well, one, tobacco exhausted the land and it fluctuated in price. Sugar and rice cultivation was very difficult until, more and more slaves would be bought, but still it was difficult, long, arduous. And the Industrial Revolution created this new large demand for cotton because the Industrial Revolution is going on around this time in Europe and in America. So all these textile industries, factories popping up, demand for cotton was greater than, sugar, rice, and tobacco. And the spread of cotton, by 1850, cotton became the dominant cash crop of the South. The Deep South, the deep southern states saw most of this production: Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And the southern part of the southern industry was mostly agricultural. Some commerce developed, but it served for the plantation economy, as your book says. So, remember, that's kind of quite the divide between the North and the South. The North, manufacturing, commerce, trade, all that jazz, infrastructure. Down the South, it's agricultural, it's agrarian, it's spread out, not too much. Okay. I believe Atlanta was one of the biggest hubs for infrastructure and if you want to call it industrialization, for lack of a better term. So here's the Deep South: Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Okay, this is what's referred to as the Deep South. The Upper South are these states: Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky, and parts of Missouri, and Arkansas, and here's some cotton. If you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, picking cotton is not just, oh, look at these fluffy little balls of cotton. There are thorns attached to this. It's very sticky, and, it's time consuming. It's menial. It's tedious. It's boring. And of course, that's why white people have other people do it for them, because they're like, I can exploit someone else's labor and make money off of it? Hell yeah. So the cotton economy continued. Why did the South not industrially develop? Money could be made in agriculture, as we saw. Just by farming, they could make a lot of money. Capital was tied up in farming, and the lack of adequate infrastructure, railroads, canals, didn't really mess with the South. So since it's not there, it probably doesn't need to be there. You have James B. DeBow, and he warned of the dependence on the South. He's going to write about favoring economic independence for the South from the North, because there is this argument that we will look at between, that the South has to buy goods from the north, and that hurts them because the stuff in the north is way more expensive if they were to buy it from foreign countries. And that's where those tariffs of 1828, 1832, they kind of hurt the South because they make their money by trading with foreign countries. And if they can't trade with foreign countries, they have to pay more money from the people in the north. Come on. That's James B. DeBow. James Dunwoody Bronson DeBow. Only 46. Okay, so some white society. Roughly 1 out of every 4 whites owned slaves. Handful, maybe less. An even smaller portion of those people who own slaves own plantations. As we know, plantations are kind of like their own inner city. And you had plenty and plenty and plenty of slaves on plantations. Okay, you could have a couple slaves here and there, but there's a smaller portion of these people who own actual plantations where the majority of slaves lived. And those that had plantations had tremendous power and influence in the town. You have George Fitzhugh, who we will look at an excerpt from, and he is a defender of slavery, defending this peculiar institution. And he will go to great lengths to justify slavery. He also favored the subordination of women. White women had few opportunities at education. Those that did focus on, the cult of domesticity, being good wives. They couldn't obtain divorces, if you remember from the last lecture. Okay, so you have the plain folk. They were mostly subsistence farmers. They made some money if they had surpluses for cash crops. But remember, subsistence farming is only making enough to get by for yourself and your family. You have few educational opportunities in the rural South unless you were, in the military. Remember, not a future surprise, but foreshadow. The South has all the military academies, and that's why they have a military advantage when the Civil War happens. You have the Hill people who lived in the Appalachian Mountain region. They oppose the planter elite, and they will resist secession, leading to the Civil War. And this mainly happens in West Virginia, because at the time, West Virginia is a part of Virginia who's in the South, who wants to secede, and they are going to resist secession. And, they were actually created a state by the time of the Civil War. And why were plantation owners so influential? They controlled markets, credit, machines. They controlled everything. They had all the money in the world. And they also had many relatives in the town. So, you mess with one, someone else is going to see, small town vibes. This is the Appalachian Mountain region, Hill people, and here's West Virginia. Okay, the peculiar institution. Okay, in mid-19th century, slavery was illegal in the Western world, except for the U.S., Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Big thing to know about is slave codes, and that regulated the behavior of slaves. Slaves could not own property, be out after dark, strike a white person, receive an education. They could not gather in large groups. They could not go to church. Okay. Overseers of slaves, they were in charge of the slaves in the fields. They were often harsh and brutal towards slaves to get them to work faster, get the lazy out of them. Slave life, obviously living conditions were harsh. Women often worked in the fields with men and then did housework. There weren't that many women around, but those that did double duty. You also have house slaves. They were in closer proximity to owners. That will often lead to more punishments because, owners not out in the field working with the overseers, trying to make their slaves do the work faster. So, when they hear, a couple of these slaves going to do the work, they're going to take it out on the house slaves inside because that's where they are. They're often isolated from other slaves, and that's why there's kind of a divide between them. And female house slaves were subject to harsh treatment from owners, and white women often, not only punishments, but also, inappropriate actions taken towards female house slaves. Slaves in the cities, there were fewer than in the rural areas, and there were fears of insurrections because, there had been some insurrections that happened and some rebellions, and they didn't want that in the cities. So there weren't that many. Here's a famous photo of it's the visible treatment, the visible mistreatment. These are scars from being whipped on the back of this slave. Okay, continuing on, the slave trade. The international slave trade, remember, by the Constitution or the Slave Trade Compromise, the international slave trade was outlawed in 1808, so no more buying and selling of slaves in the year 1808. However, it never said anything about the domestic slave trade in the United States. And as we've learned and heard, it's a humiliating experience. They also separated their families when they were brought over. And one such instance is this ship, the Amistad, where in 1839 a slave revolt happened aboard a ship in Cuba, and they tried to set sail back to Africa. It didn't happen. They were caught off the coast of America. John Quincy Adams argued that these slaves should be set free. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agrees, and these former slaves were eventually returned to Africa. Extra credit. If you are watching this, where did they eventually return to from the Amistad? Where did these slaves? Give me the court case and give me where they were relocated. All right, and I'll add that to your period 4 exam. Okay, here's the ship, the Amistad. Continuing on, resisting slavery. Resistance took many forms, the most common of which would be passive resistance, working slowly, faking illnesses. Others would be obviously running away and or breaking tools so you didn't have to work for the day. But I mean, if you were caught, it would be bad for everyone. Although slave revolts did happen, they were very rare and not that successful. You have Gabriel Prosser in 1800. The rebellion stopped before it occurred, and Prosser and his 35 followers were hanged. You have Denmark Vesey in 1822. He planned a rebellion, but word leaked out. Not good. And Nat Turner, probably one of the more famous ones, is an armed revolt in Virginia where they went around, him and his followers, killing around 60 people in Virginia. And that's going to lead to restricting African-American rights, African-American, just restricting anything they have, all right? And that usually leads to, whenever you see a rebellion, a slave rebellion happen, they're going to restrict a lot of slaves and African-American rights, no rights, anything they're going to restrict. And here's some propaganda. The horrid massacre in Virginia is showing people being attacked by former slaves. So some culture of slavery. There was a unique language that combined English and the African language soon developed in the South. Music played a large role in daily life. It was a way to communicate. It helped pass time in fields, and they, would come up with those witty tunes. You have religion. Virtually all slaves were Christian, and African-American religion was often emotional. And slave family life, although slaves could not legally marry, they still held ceremonies. A third of all families were broken up due to the slave trade and due to the internal slave trades, domestic slave trade, whatever you want to call it. So families that were created would then be separated, as the use of the need for bigger, stronger men, or the I need a woman house cleaner. They're gonna want a female slave to be in their house slave. And a frequent cause of running away was to be reunited with their families. So, they would reach out to people and try and figure out where they were located, and they would run away to them. So there you go. And here's some after work, after hours, slaves trying to enjoy the day after a long day's work. Okay, so that kind of concludes this lecture. Fairly short. But it is important. And again, I am not promoting this. I'm bringing you the insights and other views of slavery that happened in our history. It is our history. As bad as it was, as brutal as it was, it's in the American DNA, and you just learn to move on from it and not make those same mistakes. Okay? So if you did enjoy that, make sure you smash that like button. As always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.